The autumn wind cut through the small town of Cedar Ridge like a blade, carrying with it whispers that would change my life forever. I never imagined that being different, that having a gift I couldn't control, would turn me into the town's greatest fear. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I went from being called a witch to discovering that hope can bloom even in the darkest of times. Thanks to a cowboy guitarist who saw light where others saw only darkness, that it all started on a Tuesday morning in October 1887. I was 23 years old, living alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Colorado. My parents had died in a fire 3 years earlier, leaving me with nothing but their memory and a strange ability I had inherited from my grandmother. I could sense things others couldn't, feel the pain of wounded animals, and sometimes, just sometimes, I could help heal them with my touch. But in a town where superstition ran deeper than the nearby river, being different meant being dangerous. That morning, I was tending to my small garden when Mrs. Henderson's cat, Whiskers, limped toward my cabin. The poor creature had been hit by a wagon wheel and was barely breathing. Without thinking, I knelt beside him, placed my hands gently on his injured body, and closed my eyes. I felt that familiar warmth flowing through my fingers, that strange energy that had always frightened me but seemed to bring comfort to suffering creatures. Within minutes, Whiskers was purring and walking normally again. What I didn't know was that little Tommy Henderson had been watching from behind the oak tree, his eyes wide with terror at what he had just witnessed. By noon, the entire town knew what had happened. Tommy had run home screaming about the witch woman who had brought a dead cat back to life. Mrs. Henderson, instead of being grateful, was horrified. She gathered the other women of the town, and soon a crowd had formed in the main square. I could hear their voices from my cabin, growing louder and more aggressive with each passing hour. They spoke of unnatural powers, of deals with the devil, of the danger I posed to their children and their souls. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that this would pass like other rumors had before, but deep in my heart, I knew this time was different. The fear in their voices was real, and fear makes people do terrible things. As the sun began to set, I saw torches being lit in the distance. They were coming for me, and I had nowhere to run. If you're enjoying this story of courage and hope, please leave a comment with the word hope. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories. The mob arrived at my cabin just as darkness fell. There were at least 30 people, their faces twisted with anger and fear, carrying torches and ropes. Sheriff Morrison was among them, though he looked uncomfortable with the situation. "Sarah Mitchell," he called out, his voice shaking slightly, "you need to come with us. The town council wants to question you about your activities." I stepped out onto my porch, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "I haven't done anything wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I helped a wounded animal. Since when is compassion a crime?" "Compassion?" Mrs. Henderson shrieked from the crowd. "You brought that cat back from the dead. That's witchcraft, pure and simple. You're in league with Satan himself." The crowd murmured their agreement, and I saw hands tightening around the ropes they carried. I realized then that this wasn't going to be a fair questioning. They had already decided my fate. "Please," I pleaded, "just let me explain. I'm not a witch. I don't even understand what happens when I touch wounded animals. It's just something that's always been with me." But my words fell on deaf ears. The crowd pressed closer, and I could smell the fear and hatred radiating from them, like heat from their torches. That's when I heard it, the gentle strumming of a guitar cutting through the angry voices like a song of peace in the midst of chaos. From the shadows beyond the torchlight, a figure emerged on horseback. He was tall and lean, wearing a worn cowboy hat and carrying an old acoustic guitar slung across his back. His horse was a beautiful chestnut mare that moved with the grace of a dancer. The man's face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held a kindness I hadn't seen in weeks. "Evening, folks," he said in a calm, measured voice that somehow commanded attention, despite its softness. "Seems like quite a gathering you've got here. Mind if I ask what's going on?" Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, clearly relieved to have someone else to talk to. "This woman is accused of witchcraft. Stranger, we're taking her in for questioning." The cowboy's eyes found mine across the crowd, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. There was no fear in his gaze, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that made my heart skip a beat. "I know you're wondering what happens next, and trust me, The best part of this story is just beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because you won't want to miss how this classic incredible tale unfolds. The stranger dismounted his horse with fluid grace and walked slowly toward the crowd. "Name's James," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "James Mackenzie. I'm a traveling musician. Been on the road for about 5 years now. I've seen a lot of towns, met a lot of people, and I've learned that fear can make good folks do things they'll regret for the rest of their lives." His words hung in the air like morning mist, and I noticed some of the townspeople shifting uncomfortably. James continued, his voice never rising above that calm, steady tone. "Now, I don't know this young lady, but I've been watching from the ridge for the past hour, and all I see is a scared woman surrounded by an angry mob. That doesn't sit right with me." Mrs. Henderson pushed forward, her face red with indignation. "She's a witch. She brought my dead cat back to life with her devil magic." James looked at her with those kind eyes and smiled gently. "Ma'am, with all due respect, have you considered that maybe your cat wasn't as dead as you thought? Animals have a way of surprising us with their resilience, and even if this young lady did have some kind of healing gift, wouldn't that make her a blessing rather than a curse?" The crowd began to murmur among themselves, and I could see doubt creeping into some of their faces. James had planted a seed of reason in their minds, and it was beginning to grow. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat, clearly torn between his duty and his growing uncertainty. "Look, stranger, I appreciate your concern, but we have laws in this town. Accusations have been made, and they need to be investigated properly." James nodded respectfully. "I understand, Sheriff, but surely you can see that this isn't the way to conduct a proper investigation. A frightened mob with torches and ropes isn't exactly what I'd call due process." He was right, and everyone knew it. The sheriff looked around at the crowd, then back at James, then at me. I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. He was a good man caught in an impossible situation, trying to balance justice with the demands of his constituents. "What do you suggest?" the sheriff finally asked. James stepped closer to me, and I caught the scent of leather and sage on his clothes. "I suggest we all go home tonight and let cooler heads prevail. In the morning, if there are still concerns, they can be addressed in a civilized manner. But right now, all I see is fear driving good people to consider doing something they'll regret." The crowd was beginning to waver. Some of the torches were lowering, and the aggressive energy was slowly dissipating. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't ready to give up. "And what if she escapes in the night? What if she curses our children while we sleep?" James turned to look at me, and in that moment, I felt a connection I had never experienced before. It was as if he could see straight into my soul and understood everything I had been through. "She won't run," he said with absolute certainty. "Will you, Sarah?" Hearing my name spoken with such gentle confidence by this stranger sent a shiver through my entire being. I looked into his eyes and saw something that had been missing from my life for so long. Trust. Someone actually trusted me, believed in me, saw me as a person rather than a monster. "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I won't run. This is my home, and I have nothing to hide. I'll answer any questions the sheriff has, but I won't be dragged away by a mob." James smiled at me, and it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "There you have it, folks. The lady has given her word, and I'm willing to vouch for her character. You don't even know her." Someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "You're right," James replied calmly. "I don't know her history, her family, or her past, but I know fear when I see it, and I know courage when I see it. This woman is afraid, yes, but she's standing her ground and facing you all with dignity. That tells me more about her character than any accusation ever could." His words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone saw me as a human being rather than a threat. The crowd was definitely wavering now, and I could see some of them beginning to look ashamed of their actions. Sheriff Morrison made his decision. "All right, everyone go home. We'll sort this out properly in the morning. Sarah, you'll need to come to my office at 9 o'clock, sharp. And stranger, I appreciate your intervention, but this is still a matter for local law enforcement." As the crowd began to disperse, their torches creating dancing shadows as they walked away, James remained behind. He stood there quietly, his guitar still slung across his back, watching me with those understanding eyes. I felt suddenly self-conscious. aware of how I must look after hours of fear and stress. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." He stepped closer, and I could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent under the open sky. I couldn't just ride by and watch an injustice unfold. My conscience wouldn't let me. "But you don't know me. For all you know, they could be right about me." James shook his head slowly. "I've learned to read people pretty well in my travels. I've met real evil, and I've met real goodness. You, Sarah Mitchell, are definitely on the side of goodness." The way he said my name made my heart flutter in a way I had never experienced before. There was something about this mysterious cowboy that drew me to him like a moth to flame. "How did you know my name?" "I heard the sheriff say it earlier. It's a beautiful name, by the way. It suits you." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, and was grateful for the darkness that hid my blush. Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can do after what you did for me tonight." James accepted my invitation, and we sat on my small porch as I prepared coffee over the fire. The night air was crisp and filled with the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from the dying torches. He had unslung his guitar and was gently strumming a melody that seemed to calm my frayed nerves. "That's beautiful," I said, settling into the chair across from him with 2 steaming cups. "What song is that?" "Something I wrote a few years back," he replied, his fingers continuing to dance across the strings. "I call it Hope on the Horizon. I wrote it during a particularly dark time in my life, when I thought I'd lost everything that mattered." I handed him his coffee and settled back to listen. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with both sadness and promise. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" James was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something far beyond the darkness surrounding us. "I lost my wife and daughter to cholera 5 years ago. We had a small ranch in Texas, and I thought I had everything a man could want. When they died, I couldn't bear to stay there anymore, so I sold everything, bought this guitar, and started wandering." My heart ached for him. Here was a man who had experienced real loss, real pain, and yet he had stopped to help a stranger in trouble. "I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating." It was. For a long time, I thought my life was over. I rode from town to town, playing music for coins, not really caring where I ended up or what happened to me. But somewhere along the way, I realized that helping others was the only thing that made the pain bearable. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee and listening to the night sounds around us. I found myself studying his profile in the moonlight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the gentle way his hands held the guitar. There was something deeply peaceful about his presence, as if he carried a calm center within himself that nothing could disturb. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually, setting down his cup and looking directly at me. "Of course. This gift you have, this ability to heal animals, how long have you had it?" I had been dreading this question, but something about James made me want to be completely honest with him. "As long as I can remember. My grandmother had it too, though she was much better at hiding it than I am. She taught me that it was a blessing, not a curse, but she also warned me that most people wouldn't understand." "And you've never used it on people?" I shook my head. "I've never tried. Animals are different. They don't judge. They don't fear. They just accept help when it's offered. But people, I trailed off, thinking about the mob that had just left my property. "People are complicated," James finished for me. "They're afraid of what they don't understand, and they often lash out at anything that challenges their view of how the world should work." "Exactly. That's why I've always kept to myself, only helped animals when no one was watching. But today, I saw that poor cat suffering, and I couldn't just walk away." James reached across the space between us and gently touched my hand. The contact sent electricity through my entire body. "You did the right thing, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." The next morning arrived grey and overcast, matching my mood as I prepared to face Sheriff Morrison's questions. James had stayed the night, sleeping on my porch, to make sure no one tried to cause trouble while I was alone. I had barely slept, partly from anxiety about the coming interrogation, and partly because I couldn't stop thinking about the kind stranger who had risked his own safety to protect me. I found him by the well, washing his face in the cold morning water. His hair was tousled from sleep, and he looked younger somehow in the soft morning light. "Good morning," I said, suddenly shy in the daylight. "Morning, Sarah. How did you sleep?" "Not well, I'm afraid. I keep thinking about what's going to happen today." James dried his face with his bandana and turned to face me fully. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone. I'll be there with you. You don't have to do that. You've already done more than enough." "I want to," he said simply. "Besides, I have a feeling this town could use a little music to lighten the mood. Sometimes a song can change hearts better than any argument." We walked into town together, and I noticed how people stared at us from their windows and doorways. Some looked curious, others suspicious, but I also saw a few faces that seemed more thoughtful than hostile. James's intervention the night before had definitely planted seeds of doubt about the accusations against me. Sheriff Morrison's office was a small, cramped space that smelled of tobacco and old leather. The sheriff himself looked like he hadn't slept much either, and I could see the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, while James took a position by the window. "Sarah," the sheriff began, his voice tired but not unkind, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened yesterday with Mrs. Henderson's cat." I took a deep breath and recounted the events as clearly as I could, leaving nothing out. I told him about finding Whiskers injured, about the strange warmth that flowed through my hands when I touched wounded animals, and about how the cat had recovered. Throughout my story, Sheriff Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper. "And this has happened before?" he asked when I finished. "Yes, but always in private. I've helped injured birds, a fox with a broken leg, even a horse that was colicking, but I've always been careful to make sure no one saw me do it." The sheriff leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Sarah, I've known you since you were a little girl. Your parents were good people, and you've never caused any trouble in this town. But what you're describing, it's not natural. People are scared." "I understand that," I replied, "but being scared doesn't give them the right to form a mob and threaten to hang me without a trial." James spoke up from his position by the window. "Sheriff, with all due respect, fear is not evidence of wrongdoing. This young lady has never harmed anyone. In fact, from what I can see, she spent her life helping creatures that were suffering." Sheriff Morrison looked between James and me, clearly struggling with the situation. "The problem is, I have a town full of people who are convinced Sarah is dangerous. Even if I wanted to just let this go, they won't. They want action." "What kind of action?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Some are calling for you to be arrested and tried for witchcraft. Others want you banished from the town, and a few—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "A few are still talking about taking matters into their own hands." My blood ran cold. I had hoped that James's intervention the night before had calmed things down, but it seemed the fear was still simmering just below the surface. "And what do you think should happen?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the desk. "Honestly, I think you're a good woman with an unusual gift that scares people. But I also think that if you stay in Cedar Ridge, someone's going to get hurt, probably you." James stepped forward. "So you're suggesting she leave her home, abandon everything she's ever known, because other people are afraid of something they don't understand?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes discretion is the better part of valor," the sheriff replied. "Sarah, if you were to leave town voluntarily, I could convince people that the threat has been removed. You could start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere people don't know about your ... abilities." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Leave Cedar Ridge. This was my home, the place where I had been born and raised, where my parents were buried. The thought of starting over somewhere else, alone and friendless, was terrifying. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what the sheriff had just suggested. Leave everything behind because people were afraid of me. It seemed so unfair, so wrong, but as I looked at his tired face, I could see that he was trying to find a solution that would keep everyone safe, including me. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked quietly. "The town council is meeting tonight to discuss the situation. If you're going to leave voluntarily, it would be best if you were gone before then." James moved closer to my chair, and I could feel his protective presence, like a warm blanket around my shoulders. "And if she chooses to stay and fight these accusations," Sheriff Morrison's expression grew grave, "then I'll have to arrest her and hold her for trial. And given the mood of the town, I'm not sure I can guarantee her safety while she's in custody." The implications of his words were clear. If I stayed, I would likely face a trial where the outcome was predetermined by fear and superstition. And even if I somehow managed to prove my innocence, There would always be people in town who viewed me with suspicion and hatred. I need some time to think, I said, standing up on shaky legs. Of course, the sheriff replied. But Sarah, whatever you decide, decide quickly. I can't hold back the tide of public opinion much longer. As we left the sheriff's office, I felt like I was walking in a dream. Everything I had known and loved was slipping away from me, and there seemed to be nothing I could do to stop it. James and I walked in silence back toward my cabin, both lost in our own thoughts. The town seemed different now, more hostile somehow. People who had known me my entire life now crossed the street to avoid us, and I could feel their eyes following our every move. You don't have to go through this alone, James said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? I mean, if you decide to leave Cedar Ridge, you don't have to face the unknown by yourself. I've been traveling alone for 5 years, and I know how hard it can be. But I also know that sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs. Was he suggesting what I thought he was suggesting? James, you barely know me. Why would you want to complicate your life by getting involved in my problems? He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes serious and intense. Because in the short time I've known you, I've seen more genuine goodness in you than I've encountered in years of traveling. Because you remind me that there are still people in this world worth fighting for. And because, He paused, seeming to struggle with his words, because I haven't felt this alive since my family died. My heart began to race. Was this kind, mysterious cowboy saying that he had feelings for me? It seemed impossible, like something out of a fairy tale. James, I'm not asking you to make any promises, he said quickly. I'm just saying that if you decide to leave, you don't have to face the world alone. We could travel together, as friends, as companions. I could teach you about life on the road, and maybe you could teach me about hope again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of difficult decisions and painful preparations. I walked through my small cabin, touching the furniture my father had made, looking at the quilts my mother had sewn, trying to memorize every detail of the only home I had ever known. The thought of leaving it all behind was almost unbearable. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to realize that James was right about one thing. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs. Cedar Ridge would never be the same for me now. Even if I somehow managed to clear my name, there would always be whispers, always be fear. I would spend the rest of my life walking on eggshells, hiding who I truly was. James spent the day helping me sort through my belongings, deciding what I could take and what I would have to leave behind. He was patient and understanding, never pushing me to make a decision, but always there to offer support when the emotions became overwhelming. You know, he said, as we packed my few precious possessions into saddlebags, leaving doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it means choosing to fight for your happiness in a different place. But what if I can't find happiness anywhere else? What if Cedar Ridge was my only chance at having a real home? James set down the book he was packing and looked at me with those kind eyes that had already become so dear to me. Sarah, home isn't a place. It's not a building or a town or even a piece of land. Home is where you feel safe, where you feel accepted, where you can be yourself without fear. If Cedar Ridge can't offer you that anymore, then it was never really your home to begin with. His words resonated deep in my soul. He was right, of course. I had been so focused on the physical place that I had forgotten what home really meant. As evening approached, we could hear the sounds of the town council meeting beginning in the distance. Voices carried on the wind, and I could make out angry tones in heated discussions. They were deciding my fate without me, and somehow that made the decision easier. I'm ready, I said, shouldering my pack and taking one last look around the cabin. James nodded and helped me secure my belongings. To his horse, are you sure? Once we leave, there's no going back. I'm sure. You're right about home being where you feel safe and accepted. I haven't felt that way in Cedar Ridge for a long time, maybe never. It's time to find out what's waiting for me beyond these mountains. We mounted his horse together, and I wrapped my arms around his waist as we began to ride away from everything I had ever known. As we crested the hill that overlooked the town, I turned back for one final look at Cedar Ridge. The lights in the windows looked warm and inviting from a distance, but I knew the truth about what lay behind those walls. Any regrets? James asked softly. I thought about his question as we rode through the darkness, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, marking time like a heartbeat. No, I said finally. No regrets, only hope for what comes next. And for the first time in weeks, I truly meant it. With James beside me and the open road ahead, I felt like I was finally free to become who I was meant to be. We rode through the night, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and Cedar Ridge. James seemed to know exactly where he was going, following trails that were invisible to me, but clear as day to his experienced eyes. As dawn broke over the mountains, we stopped by a small stream to rest the horse and eat some of the provisions we had packed. "Where are we going?" I asked, as we sat by the water, sharing bread and dried meat. "There's a town called Harmony about 3 days' ride from here," James replied. "It's bigger than Cedar Ridge, more diverse. People there are used to strangers passing through, and they tend to mind their own business. I thought we could start there, see how you like it." The name itself sounded promising. Harmony, a place where different kinds of people could coexist peacefully. And what would we do there? How would we live? James smiled and patted his guitar case. "I'll play music in the saloons and at town gatherings. People always need entertainment, and they're usually willing to pay for it. As for you, well, that depends on what you want to do. You could work in a shop, or help the local doctor, or," he paused, looking thoughtful, "or you could use your gift to help people instead of just animals." The suggestion took me by surprise. Help people. "But James, you saw what happened when people found out about my abilities. They called me a witch." That was one town, Sarah, one small, closed-minded town, where everyone has known everyone else for generations. In a bigger place, with more diverse people, your gift might be seen as exactly what it is, a blessing. I wanted to believe him, but the fear was still too fresh, too raw. What if they react the same way? What if we have to keep running? James reached over and took my hand in his. "Then we'll keep running until we find a place where you can be yourself without fear." "But Sarah, you can't spend your whole life hiding who you are. That's not living, that's just surviving." Over the next 2 days of travel, James and I talked about everything and nothing. He told me stories of his adventures on the road, of the people he had met, and the places he had seen. I shared memories of my childhood, of my parents and grandmother, of the dreams I had once had for my future. With each mile we traveled, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The constant fear and anxiety that had plagued me in Cedar Ridge began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. James was right. I had been surviving, not living, and it was time to change that. On our second night on the trail, as we sat around a small campfire under a canopy of stars, James played his guitar and sang softly. His voice was rich and warm, filled with emotion that spoke of both loss and hope. I found myself mesmerized by the music, by the way his fingers moved across the strings, by the peaceful expression on his face as he lost himself in the melody. "That was beautiful," I said when he finished the song. "Thank you." Music has always been my way of making sense of the world, of processing emotions that are too big for words. I wish I had something like that, some way to express what I'm feeling. James looked at me thoughtfully. "You do have something like that, Sarah. Your gift, your ability to heal. That's your way of touching the world, of making it a little better than you found it. Music heals the soul, but what you do heals the body. Both are precious gifts." I had never thought of my abilities in quite that way before. In Cedar Ridge, my gift had been seen as something dark and frightening, but James saw it as something beautiful, something valuable. His perspective was changing how I saw myself, and I was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the monster people had made me out to be. On the third day, we finally saw Harmony spread out in the valley below us. It was indeed larger than Cedar Ridge, with more buildings, more people, and more activity. I could see a main street, lined with shops and businesses, several churches of different denominations, and what looked like a small hospital or medical clinic. "It's bigger than I expected," I said, feeling a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. "That's good," James replied. "Bigger means more opportunities, more chances to find your place. And look there." He pointed to a building with a sign I couldn't quite read from our distance. "That looks like a medical practice. Maybe the doctor could use an assistant." As we rode into town, I was struck by the diversity of the people we saw. There were cowboys and farmers, shopkeepers and craftsmen, families and single people, young and old. It was a bustling, vibrant community that seemed to welcome newcomers rather than view them with suspicion. We stopped at the local inn to secure rooms and get information about the town. The innkeeper, a friendly woman named Mrs. Patterson, was happy to tell us about Harmony's history and current residents. "We've got a good doctor here, Dr. Samuel Winters," she said. "When James mentioned that I might be interested in medical work, he's been looking for an assistant for months now. Lost his last helper when she got married and moved away. He's a good man, very progressive in his thinking. Doesn't judge people by their past or their differences." This sounded promising, and I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. Maybe James was right. Maybe there was a place in the world where I could use my gifts to help people instead of hiding them in fear. The next morning, James and I walked to Dr. Winter's clinic together. It was a clean, well-organized building that smelled of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs. Dr. Winters himself was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands that spoke of years spent healing others. "So you're interested in medical work," he said after James had introduced us. "Do you have any experience?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment of truth. I could lie, pretend to have conventional medical training, and hope that my natural abilities would be enough. Or I could be honest and risk rejection once again. "I don't have formal training," I said carefully, "but I have a natural ability to sense when people or animals are in pain, and sometimes I can help ease that pain through touch." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrows, but his expression remained open and curious rather than suspicious. "That's interesting. Can you give me an example?" I told him about some of the animals I had helped, being careful to present my abilities as intuitive rather than supernatural. To my surprise, he listened with genuine interest rather than fear or skepticism. "You know," he said when I finished, "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've learned that healing is as much art as science. Some people have a natural gift for it, an intuition that can't be taught in medical school. If you're willing to learn the scientific side of medicine to complement your natural abilities, I think we could work very well together." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Here was a doctor, a man of science, who was not only accepting of my unusual gifts, but actually saw them as valuable. James squeezed my hand encouragingly, and I felt tears of relief and gratitude welling up in my eyes. "I would be honored to work with you, Dr. Winters," I said, my voice thick with emotion. And so began a new chapter of my life in Harmony, where I learned that hope truly can bloom even in the darkest of times, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is someone who sees us not as we fear we are, but as we have the potential to become. Years have passed since that terrifying night when an angry mob came to my door with torches and ropes. James and I never left Harmony. We found not just a new home, but a new life filled with purpose and love. I became Dr. Winter's most trusted assistant, and eventually, people began seeking me out specifically for my healing touch. What had once been called witchcraft was now seen as a gift from God. James and I were married the following spring in a ceremony attended by half the town. He still plays his guitar, now in our own home filled with laughter and music. We've helped countless people over the years, and I've learned that my grandmother was right. My gift truly is a blessing, not a curse. Sometimes I think about Cedar Ridge and wonder if the people there ever realized how wrong they were. But mostly, I'm just grateful for that night when a cowboy guitarist showed me that hope still lives, even in the darkest of times. What do you think about Sarah's incredible journey from fear to hope? Have you ever had to leave everything behind to find where you truly belong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. The next story we'll share is just as incredible, so make sure you don't miss it.